I do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
Don't ever say to her that
What about the Chautauqua Institute?
Introductory
discussion on the ethical
We left.
more of a community.
We're trying to take back over.
Currently doing in autism.
Beverly McIver is one of the most acclaimed black female painters working today. Her larger-than-life portraits of her family and herself examine race, gender, and social identity. Raised in a housing project in Greensboro, North Carolina, McIver is the youngest of 3 girls. In 2004, just as her career was taking off, her mother died of pancreatic cancer, and McIver became the legal guardian of her mentally disabled sister, Renee. We'll talk with her about growing up in the segregated South, about her career as a painter, and about the HBO documentary that chronicles 6 years of her life as Renee's caregiver. Here's our conversation with Beverly McIver. Beverly McIver, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You're actually back to Penn State. You earned your Master's of Fine Arts from Penn State back in 1992 and were invited back here in 2010 to receive a Distinguished Alumni Fellow Award, which is Penn State's highest honor. You're honored because of this amazing career that you have made for yourself as an artist. And I was surprised to read that you started your career here at Penn State as a psychology major.
That's correct. I wanted to major in something that I thought would yield me some money.
A ticket out, really.
That's right.
You said of the life you led in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Right, right. Out of the projects. So I wanted to be able to make a living, and you know, as everyone knows, being an artist is not the easiest way to make a living, to have a financial income. So I started off as a psychology major, and then I switched.
You didn't even pick up a paintbrush until pretty late in life, right?
Right, right. I didn't paint when I was in high school, and I started painting when I was in undergraduate. Yeah, like 3 years into my undergraduate degree.
And an art teacher at the North Carolina Central University said, you could get really good at this.
That's right, that's right. It was Elizabeth Lentz, who was my teacher and who really, really believed in me and said, you know, if you just work hard at this, you could be really good at this. And I took her at her word, and I saw it as my ticket out of the projects. So I focused and I worked hard to learn how to paint.
Your painting, mostly what you paint are portraits. And the interesting thing to me is that when you came to Penn State, the faculty here actually discouraged you from really what your trademark is.
Yes.
Why do you suppose they discouraged you from doing portraits?
Well, I'll tell you exactly why. I had a committee member who's no longer at Penn State now, who was like, your still lives are beautiful. They have a rich history, and you should, people get it, and you know, and white people, I quote, he said, are not going to buy black paintings. They're not going to buy people of color to hang on their wall. So you really want to stick with these still lives and keep painting them.
What gave you the courage to say, no, this is what I'm painting? Because especially when your motivation was getting out of the projects, that could have derailed a lot of people from their true passion.
Yeah. Well, I had another professor here by the name of Richard Mayhew, which is the reason that I decided to come to graduate school at Penn State.
A phenomenal landscape artist who happens to be black.
Yes. And he said, he came in my studio once, and he had on like a 9x11 sheet of paper was a pastel portrait that he had done of a woman. And he said, look at this. And he said, if you want to paint portraits of black people, you should paint them. And he said, here, take this, you can have it. And he walked out. And I was like, oh my God, I got this piece, this work of art from Richard Mayhew, which I still have in my home. And since then, he's given me one of his landscapes, oil paintings. And so he was really the turning point for me in saying, you know what, I'm gonna listen to him and paint portraits.
One thing about your portraits, they're mostly of you and your family, your sister Renee, who we'll find out more about in a moment, your mother, mostly women, some men. And they are selling, some of your pieces are selling for $25,000.
Right.
Who's buying them? And is it important to you, because the content to me is so personal, does it matter to you who purchases them?
Well, the paintings are like my babies. And so it's like, having your babies.
Putting them out in the world.
Being adopted and going out in the world. And so it's important to me in that I want the person who buys it to really love it and want to live with it. And as far as I know, I've been fortunate enough that, that has happened. My biggest audience, which is very interesting, is not necessarily Black people. It's gay men.
Do you know why?
I think it's because they too feel marginalized, and I think it's because they know what it means to be in the margin. And therefore they identify with me talking about, my sister Renee, who's in the margin, and even myself as an African American painter. So.
It's interesting, and you gave a talk today at Penn State, and the title of the talk was Worthy of Winning. Right. And one of the audience members wanted to know if the portraits that you've painted of yourself are a sort of diary. You can actually look back at photographs that you've made, not photographs, I'm sorry, paintings that you've made over your career, and kind of know how you were feeling. There's the Depression series, there's the Radcliffe girl, which is, wow, these just brilliant, beautiful, happy, smiling face. Yeah. Is it kind of a visual diary for you of where you've been and how far you've come?
Yeah, I don't think about it like that when I'm actually making the work, but it has definitely been that. When I always say whatever comes up, comes out. And so a lot of time when I'm in the studio painting, I don't know what's going to come up or out onto the canvas. And, so if I'm feeling depressed, when I made those depression paintings, I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to my studio to make depression paintings because I'm depressed. They just came out.
Well, you mentioned Richard Mayhew a moment ago, and I was reading a little bit about him, and he said that he paints from the inside out, and that when he's painting, he's literally in a trance and he doesn't know what's going to end up on the canvas. So I'm kind of curious about your process. What happens when you go into your painting space, and do you go in the morning or at night, and how does it all work?
Yeah. That it's a lot like how Rick paints, in that I go into the studio and I try to quiet myself because I'm thinking, I need to do the laundry, or did I cook something to eat, or whatever. I have all these voices, and I try to make them all leave the studio, and I just start with a very general feel, like, okay, I'm feeling, peaceful right now. And I look at images that I've taken photographs of.
In fact, you start your painting with a photograph.
That's
you
right.
project it onto a wall.
Right. And I flip through and I look at all the images, and I really just intuitively decide which one I'm going to paint at that moment. And that's the one I start with. And then that leads to other paintings. I work on about 3 or 4 paintings at a time.
Do you ever abandon a painting?
Yes, but you must know, as someone who grew up in the projects, I am really, really too frugal to abandon. The abandon list is because I think that's wasting canvas and money and paint. So I try to save most of them.
Let's talk a little bit about growing up in the projects, because it certainly has permeated who you are and what you've done. You were bused actually from Greensboro, North Carolina, to a white school.
Right.
What was that experience like?
Well, it was very interesting because I was living in the projects, and like our neighbor got killed, and they found her in the dumpster, and then of course in 1979, the Greensboro massacre happened right in front of our apartment. So I had a very, very...
The Greensboro massacre, by the way, was anti-KKK group protesting against the KKK coming into town, and 5 people died, got shot right in front of your doorstep.
That's exactly right. right. So the KKK shot 5 people right there. And my mother witnessed the entire thing from our kitchen window. And our little green Pinto, which is in the footage, was also shot. There was a hole through the back of the car. Surprisingly, it didn't explode.
As Pintos did.
Exactly, exactly. So I had a very, very negative view of what it meant to be black in the South, in Greensboro, because of those experiences. And so for me, being bussed out of that environment and going across town to, middle class white people, schools, K through 12, it was a godsend for me. I mean, the equipment at the at the schools was much better. The educational system, the books, everything was plentiful.
You ended up joining, of all things, in this white high school, a clown club.
Right.
And you dressed up like a clown, and as anyone knows, clown makeup starts with a white foundation.
Right, right. Well, it's sort of interesting. The school, Grimsley High School, where I was predominantly white. And me and my sister decided to join the clown club. And so for me, it was just like this cool liberation that I could put on this disguise and dress up and really hide the fact that I was black and from the projects and poor and on welfare. I could hide all of that, which I was doing anyway, but now I had a disguise.
You were hiding it in the fact that if you went to a white girlfriend's home when her parents dropped you off, you'd say, drop me off here in front of
That's
some
right.
random house so that they wouldn't know. That must have been difficult to really, you were hiding who you were and where you came from.
Well, at the time, it was just what I had to do. And I didn't think about it. I thought, I wasn't thinking. Now, today, I would think, I had to walk how far? But now, back then, I was just like, I just didn't want them to know because I knew that there was judgment placed on poor people in the projects. And one of the projects that I grew up in, Morningside Home, was one of the worst and toughest in terms of violence in Greensboro.
One of the interesting things about growing up poor, I've read all kinds of biographies of famous, very, very extremely successful people. And it's one of the things that's hard to kind of shed. And I read a quote from Cher, for example, who was scared to death of being poor even today. Yeah. She said it's kind of like the fat girl who loses 500 pounds, but she's always the fat girl inside.
Yeah. I completely relate to that. That's one of my biggest fears, is that I'll be sent back to the projects. I live with that every day.
And complicating all of this is not only were you living, this bright young woman living in the projects, your sister, your oldest sister,
right.
Was mentally disabled.
Yes, yes.
Tell us about Renee.
So Renee is my oldest sister, and she's 52, but she has the mindset of a 3rd grader. And she also has epilepsy. And, growing up with Renee was tough because she really took all the attention.
Sucked the air out of the room.
Was great at doing that. Because my mother had to focus on her. She was special needs and her well-being, and some of that responsibility fell to me and my other sister. And Renee definitely would cast a huge shadow over us.
Now, at some point, you made a promise to your mother. I'm not sure how casually it was, that when she's gone, don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of Renee.
Right, right. My mother asked me, this was actually a couple of years before she died, and she was fine, she was healthy. She had a high blood pressure, but other than that, she was just fine. And she said, she told me that Renee had said that she had talked to Renee, and Renee had said, I want to come and live with you. And I thought, what? Why did she choose me? you know, given that I'm single and
Your sister
as an
Ronnie
artist,
is married.
she's married, and you know they're in North Carolina, and you know Renee could have continued a very similar life that she had with my mother if she had stayed with my sister. But instead, you know, she wanted to come live with me in New York or Arizona or, you know, all the other places that we've lived.
And we should say that your mother died of pancreatic cancer in 2004.
Right.
And shortly thereafter, Renee did indeed move in with you and stayed with you for nearly 6 years.
Right.
Your friends have suggested that you needed her and she needed you, and this unconditional love,
Right.
even though there was a certain amount of resentment.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think Renee, you know, like a child and through a child's eye, she was picking the fun sister. You know, the one that traveled, the one that, you know, seemed a little bit on the edge, and the fun one. Smart, right? And I think that that's why, and I think that, you know, I was patient with her and listened to her repeat birthdays to me over and over and over again. So I think that, you know, that's why that decision was made. But, you know, it became really tough because I'm single and, you know, I've only raised some cats. They're good cats, but they're
Model
cats. And, you know, I just didn't have any experience with how to take care of this person that in one instance could be a child and in another instance be a really, you know, profound, smart human being. And I didn't know which one I was getting from minute to minute.
Now, we're going to backtrack a little bit. In 2003, 2004, you earned a Radcliffe Fellowship. And while you were there, you happened to be in the same class as a filmmaker, a very successful filmmaker by the name of Jean Jordan. She heard the story that you had promised when your mother died that you would take Renee. And somehow this came up. Tell us how that all turned into this HBO film, Raising Renee.
Well, initially, you know, Jean would come in, her studio was right next to mine, and she would come into my studio and say, your paintings remind me of film stills. And you know, me and my husband are really interested in making a film about you and your art and you being an artist because, you know, my mother wasn't sick or dead or anything like that at the time. And so right at the end of the Radcliffe Fellowship, my mother, you know, got sick. And so then it became about the promise that I had made to my mother to take care of Renee. And so they got, you know, there is some footage of my mother in a hotel room actually in New York when she came to visit me.
Because the filming actually began as your career was skyrocketing. You had a solo show, your first solo show in New York City, and your mother and Renee came to see the show.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So it's sort of an interesting time. I mean, I was living in New York at that time with the studio space, very similar to what I'm doing now. And, you know, Renee and Mom come to New York for the first time, which was, we go see The Lion King and on Broadway, and it was just fantastic. It was a great time.
What was the experience like of being filmed? Because you absolutely seem, all of you, to not even know that the cameraman is present in all of the footage that make up this film.
Yeah, well, Steve Asher, the husband part of this team, is the cameraman, and he would always just be quiet, and I could always just see his, you know, his facial, like, you know, this would be covered, but I could see the rest of his face, and he would never laugh or never say, I can't believe you said that, or, you know, make any sort of judgment physically or orally about what I was doing. And so I was just being me because I didn't know how he was taking it or how it was perceived or, you know, or anything. I was just being me.
And you actually had no idea how the film would be put together until after this. And in fact, the filmmakers waited. We should say that after 5 or 6 years,
Right.
you figured out a way for Renee to live independently in her own apartment in a
Right.
assisted living
Yes.
arrangement. And the filmmakers held on to the film, didn't release it for an entire year to make sure that it would work.
Yeah, yeah. They're funny because they would call me and they would say, call us when anything, exciting happens. And because I hadn't seen any footage of the film, I didn't know what that meant to them.
Right.
So I would call them and I'd say, hey, I'm doing blah. And they'd say, no, that's nothing.
I'm
And
doing
I'd
a
call them,
show.
and they'd be like,
Yeah.
we don't care. And then I'll never forget, I called them and I said, Renee's moving into this apartment. And I said, is that important? And they were like, yes. And they got on a plane and flew down to film that event of Renee moving into this apartment on her own. So, and I also want to say that, there was I had lots of people, family members and people who don't matter, tell me that, that I was selfish for moving Renee out of my house. They couldn't see how this opportunity for Renee to be on her own and have her own space and her own independence.
And still be cared for.
And still be cared
safe.
for very much was important.
Do you think your mother would approve of her living in an apartment? Would she be okay with your decision?
I think my mother would definitely approve of Renee living on her own. I think my mother could not do that for Renee, in part because of finances and also because my mother was overprotective. And she would have never let Renee move out because they were codependent on each other. But Renee often says to me, she'll say, Mama's looking down from heaven and she's smiling. She's proud of us. And I said, she sure is.
You said that you cry every time you see the film. What parts of
Yeah.
it make you cry?
My mother dying. I think, or the interview that I did of my mother 2 years earlier, where I asked her if she's happy.
That was a
and
tough
she
part.
has any
Yes.
regrets. And she says, I wouldn't have gotten married. And I think, what? You wouldn't, what? You wouldn't have gotten married? I understand that, she married a loser. And it
And
was
actually,
a tough life.
you're a love child. You aren't
That's
even.
exactly right.
Your mother had an affair with someone when she was in this very bad marriage.
Yes, that's exactly right. So I guess it makes me sad because I would have wished that my mother would have had a better relationship with a man and a better, life in that regard, So every time I see that, it makes me sad. And it also makes me sad, when I'm burying my cat in the backyard, there's this behind the scenes, the cat dies and the cat is at the vet in a bag and they've put the cat in the freezer because I couldn't pick the cat up right away. And Steve is with me and he's like, we got to go get the cat. And I was like, I can't go get the cat. I can't.
It's funny what thing kind of pushes you over the edge to let your emotions flow, and that is the death of your cat.
Oh my God.
Where do you see yourself 10 years from now? And I guess what I'm really wondering is Beverly McIver going to be known for portraits, or is there something else waiting in the wings?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I love to paint. I love to teach. I love working with young artists. But it's also important. This is the first time. Today was the first time this morning where I talked about being worthy, which is something that has just really been on my heart for a long time.
It's the first time you said it out loud?
It's the first time that I physically have shared it with an audience. And it just went over so well. And so many people came up to me afterwards and said, you know, I'm working on feeling worthy. I know what you're talking about, you know, how hard it is. I have tapes that are playing in my head from childhood that tell me that I'm not, but I'm, you know, rewriting those tapes. And I thought, oh my God, you know, talking about this is really profound. And people need to hear it, and people need to rewrite those tapes.
And you're not afraid to be honest.
No. Well, I'll just Sagittarius, open mouth, insert foot.
Beverly McIver, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Beverly McIver. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll also find information about the HBO documentary, Raising Renee. I'm Patty Satalia. We hope you'll join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU.